Hi team. We're often asked about the role that exogenous ketones can play in clinical treatment, and there are a lot of very exciting potential benefits from exogenous ketones, ranging from treatment for traumatic brain injury through to migraine, particularly in the treatment of epilepsy, which is where obviously ketogenic diet research all started, and in the treatment of other neurodegenerative disorders, particularly Alzheimer's, age-related cognitive decline. But one of the things that often pops up whenever we're talking about exogenous ketone supplements is, do exogenous ketones inhibit ketosis? And it's typically suggested that they do. And there's one study in particular that's often cited in support of that. I've actually cited that paper myself in our review of nutritional supplements to induce ketosis, which I'll post a link to. But it's important to understand what that actually means. So we're going to go through that a little bit today, and I hope this clears it up just a little bit. So let's look at some of the key intro points. It's commonly stated that exogenous ketones suppress endogenous ketone production. And what a lot of people take that to mean is that by taking exogenous ketone supplements, you will completely stop your endogenous ketone production. And that won't happen because the body is always producing ketones. It's always producing acetoacetate, it's always producing beta-hydroxybutyrate, having convertibility between the ketones. And the reason we don't see high levels if we're eating a high-carb diet or we're not sort of particularly fat-adapted is that we're not producing a lot because we don't need to. We don't have that fuel requirement because we've got plenty of carbohydrate, and we use ketones very quickly and very efficiently. So it doesn't necessarily lead to a marked rise in blood ketones that we see on a ketogenic diet, but the fact remains that we're always producing ketones. There's actually limited data to support the contention that exogenous ketone supplements inhibit endogenous ketone production. And really we're relying on one primary study to see that. It's something that I've, as I mentioned, cited in papers, but it's not well understood, and few people, I think, have really looked into what the study actually showed. The existing evidence shows that exogenous ketone administration does reduce endogenous ketone production, but it doesn't eliminate it. So let's take a deeper look into that. I'll post the link to the study itself. It was a study published in 1975, so it's a relatively old study, and it had relatively few numbers of participants as well. There were 6 non-obese female participants who fasted for somewhere between 2 and 23 days. So out of those 6 subjects, one fasted for 2 days, one was fasted for 23 days, and the rest were variations between 2 and 23 days. So we need to understand this was a fasted ketogenic study. The beta-hydroxybutyrate levels in those participants ranged from 3 to approximately 11. So we're looking at pretty high ketone levels because this was fasting ketosis or starvation ketosis. The beta-hydroxybutyrate levels, or those levels of blood ketones, the primary ketone beta-hydroxybutyrate, was roughly proportionate to the duration of the fast. So we saw a trend in this paper for there to be higher ketone levels the longer the fast, which we would completely expect because the longer you fast, typically the higher your ketone levels to a point. Now, in the study, they weren't supplied with ketone salts or esters because those weren't available at the time, to my knowledge. Instead, they were given an IV or intravenous infusion of an acetoacetate compound. So this is acetoacetate, one of the ketone bodies, but not beta-hydroxybutyrate. It is converted into beta-hydroxybutyrate in the body, so it's one of those ketone bodies. Anyway, this was IV infused into the participants, and that IV infusion of relatively high-strength acetoacetate reduced endogenous ketone production by 10 to 31%. So it certainly didn't completely suppress it, and in fact the reduction in ketone production was relatively trivial. And you can actually see that in this graph to the side here. You can see that blood ketones, if you just look at beta-hydroxybutyrate, BOHB there, were on average around 5 millimoles. This is across the group, so that's relatively high. And then with the infusion of acetoacetate, because it breaks down to beta-hydroxybutyrate, that then went up and was around sort of 7 millimoles. So there's definitely an increase, as you'd expect, because you're pumping ketones into the blood. But here you also see the endogenous production rates. So endogenous production rates, as shown by the inflow rate of total ketones, were at around sort of 2 millimoles per minute there. That dropped, but it certainly wasn't completely eliminated. So you can see there that drop of between 10 and 31%. And of course, with the exogenous ketones, that level of total ketones in the blood was a little bit higher. But to summarize, it certainly wasn't completely eliminated. And in fact, the inhibition wasn't all that much. The inhibition of ketone production was also relative to the length of fast and the level of BOHB, the level of beta-hydroxybutyrate, which we would also expect, because when you think about it, the higher the levels of something in the blood, the less you're going to require to be added in. So if you add something in, there's going to be an even greater inhibitory effect. But still at those high levels of ketones, we're talking 10 millimoles or so of beta-hydroxybutyrate, was the greatest reduction. Around a third or so of endogenous production was inhibited. So still not a massive inhibition, and probably something that we would not consider to be clinically meaningful. So some of the key take-home points here is that the inhibition of ketones is likely to be relative to baseline levels. In other words, if you have higher ketone levels, number one, you don't really need to be providing extra from a supplement anyway, but the inhibition of your endogenous production is likely to be greater because you have a lowered requirement of additional ketones in that state. But overall, the inhibition of ketone production appears to be relatively minor anyway. When we're talking 10 to 31%, it's not a heck of a lot. And within normal habitual ketogenic diets that give that nutritional ketosis range of, let's say, 0.5 millimoles to around 3 millimoles, a lot lower than what was seen in this study, we wouldn't necessarily expect endogenous ketone production to be markedly reduced by exogenous ketones. So if you're using exogenous ketones as a fuel as a low-carb athlete, or to improve your clarity and cognition, or for other benefits, or if you're using it because it's clinically indicated for your condition, I certainly wouldn't worry about taking those inhibiting your endogenous ketone production. So I hope that clears things up just a little bit. We will be posting up more educational videos. If you have any comments, please let us know. And if you'd like to study with us to learn more about carb-appropriate nutrition and the science behind holistic evidence-based nutrition, go to hpn.ac.nz.